Since 1949, the month of May has been observed as Mental Health Awareness Month in the United States. And if you've known about me for any amount of time, you probably have learned that this is a topic I am passionate about. Mental health challenges have impacted my family, they've impacted me personally, and I've written and spoken a lot about my own journey at this confluence of faith and mental health struggle and vocation. The theme for this year's Mental Health Awareness Month is more than enough. According to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, this month is an opportunity for all of us to come together and remember the inherent value we each hold, no matter our diagnosis, appearance, socioeconomic status, background, or ability. I love this connection between ending stigma and remembering our inherent value. As Christians, we believe that inherent value comes from the image of God in each of us. God knows us by name. In the midst of the many things that try to distract us or make us forget that divine image, we get together in prayer, in fellowship, to ground ourselves and remind ourselves of that sacred value. Now, mental wellness is also a big part of what our congregation has discerned as our mission focus. And it isn't a coincidence, by the way, that that's true. And also, this is something that I'm personally passionate about. That mission focus was one of the things that caught my eye about Bon Air Christian Church when we first began mutually discerning a potential call together back in 2020. So I wanted to mark this first Sunday in May as a sort of mental health Sunday. But many of you have already heard at least part of my own story related to this, so I wanted to start in a bit of a different place. So I'm going to talk about shepherds and sheep. Bear with me for a second. For one reason or another, I have spent more time around sheep and shepherds than I would suppose your average American millennial has. And there's one encounter in particular, that has really stuck with me. It was 2008, and I was serving with one of our global ministries partners in Jerusalem, and I had taken a trip to visit with some ministry partners in the southern West Bank. We were accompanying a group of Palestinian shepherds as they grazed their flocks in the South Hebron Hills, which is in the middle of nowhere. It feels a little bit like traveling through time. And I noticed something, which is that the shepherds spoke pretty constantly to their sheep. Now, of course, they weren't speaking in English to their sheep, but they also weren't speaking in their native tongue of Arabic. They were speaking to their sheep pretty constantly in something I could only really think to call sheep speak. Like their calls, their commands, their directions to their flocks imitated the same kinds of vocalizations that their sheep would use to communicate with each other, which makes a lot of sense, right? Like if your job is to keep a bunch of sheep together and headed in a common direction, then probably a really good place to start would be learning to speak sheep. It's just like Jesus says, right? Sheep will follow a shepherd because they know the shepherd's voice. And the good shepherd, Jesus says, knows their own sheep by name. One of my old professors, the New Testament scholar Sharon Ringy, talks about this image of the Jesus as the good shepherd as just one of many ways that John's gospel explores the theme of friendship. You'll remember that in John's gospel, Jesus calls the disciples friends. Now, she points out the concept of shepherd and friend are not exact parallels. There's a major difference, right? Friends have a mutual relationship. But she says, despite that obvious lack of the mutuality that usually marks a relationship of friendship, the description of the shepherd echoes several aspects of that relationship. In the nature of things, shepherds and sheep spend long hours together. That leads to a recognition that goes both ways. The sheep respond to the shepherd's voice, and the shepherd knows the sheep's names, or probably has actually given them names that highlight their uniqueness, like Old Curly Horn or Mrs. Black Socks. Only in the case of my new shepherd friends, the sheep's names weren't Old Curly Horn or Mrs. Black Socks or their Arabic equivalents. They were sheep names, right? The good shepherds I was with didn't just know their sheep by names, they knew their sheep by names the sheep would recognize. Which to me really resonates with Jesus' analogy of himself as the good shepherd. Jesus, the good shepherd, doesn't just happen to have names for us at a distance. The good shepherd is the one who comes alongside us, stands in solidarity with us when we are suffering or in distress, empathizes with our human condition, and does all of this, right, as the culmination of God's plan to redeem and heal that very condition. The good shepherd lays down their life for the sheep. And as I hope I showed you earlier, that might mean literally laying down and getting dirty and muddy in order to protect and to care and ultimately to save, not to steal and destroy, but rather to give life and that abundantly. Jesus knows us by name. And not just in the sense of knowing that my name happens to be David, but knows us by name in that sense of knowing us wholly, completely, on a personal level. Knowing who we are inside and out, knowing us by the names that resonate within the depths of our souls. Now, I could recite a lot of statistics and a lot of facts about mental health. I could tell you, for example, that approximately 1 in 5 adults in the U.S. will experience mental illness this year, and that less than half of them will receive treatment. I could tell you that less than half of the counties in the United States have a single practicing psychiatrist within the county lines. I could tell you that people with severe mental illness are far more statistically likely to be victims of violence in this country rather than perpetrators, despite prevalent stereotypes of people with mental illnesses. I could explain to you the difference in the diagnostic and statistic manual definitions between bipolar type 1 and bipolar type 2, and I think it's important that we learn things like that, right? Like that's why we're hosting a Mental Health 101 workshop on May 20th and planning ahead for similar types of education and training in the future, because that stuff is important to know. But in the end, statistics and facts, all of the statistics and facts in the world, won't add up to a hill of beans if we end up thinking of people with mental health challenges as just a bunch of numbers, rather than as people with names like David. In fact, I'd go a step further and suggest that the whole reason to know the facts and the numbers and the labels and the terminology is exactly so that we can come to know people by name. Let me tell you a little bit of what I mean. A few years ago, I was on the phone with a pastor in Chicago. He'd reached out to me after he read one of my books, and his congregation had just gone through a discernment process very similar to the one that we did here at Bon Air Christian Church just a few years ago. They had talked to school leaders and community leaders and first responders and local government officials, and they were trying to get a sense of what the real needs were in the neighborhood surrounding their church, and mental health just kept coming up. And my colleague, this pastor, who I'd never met in person, said to me that this felt a bit intimidating to him because he said, look, I'm just a pastor. I don't know anything about mental health care or mental illness. So I did the thing I knew how to do, he said, which was to pray. He said, my church has a time in our service where we lift up joys and concerns in prayer. And so one week I decided I would pray for folks in our community who were experiencing depression and anxiety. And another week I prayed for folks who were experiencing schizophrenia. And another week for folks experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. And then another week I prayed for folks who were experiencing bipolar disorder. And I teared up at that. Because when this pastor prayed that prayer, he was praying for me. Even though he didn't know who I was yet, even though he had never heard my name. But even without knowing my name, he had nevertheless named me in prayer publicly in a way that doesn't always happen. And it is hard to put into words how meaningful that is. It's hard to explain how powerful it is to get named. Jesus knows us by name, and maybe that's why he is willing, ultimately, to lay down his life for us, to get right down here in the dirt and the muck of human existence, to care for us and share abundant life with us and save us. And then Jesus sends us out with that same model in mind to care for people and to know people by their name, to lay down our lives for each other. And by the way, the Good Shepherd lays down their life in order to protect and give life. As Sharon Ringy says, while the purposes of the shepherd is to safeguard the life of the sheep, even at the risk of his own life, the intent is that the shepherd be alive in the morning. Similarly, the point of the standard of friendship is that the friend be prepared to risk their life on behalf of a friend, but life and not death is the purpose. The purpose is life. And to this end, Jesus commits his whole life, even if necessary, to the point of death. The purpose is life. And Jesus sends us out to do the same. I'm not just saying that, by the way, because it's a good kind of pastory thing that you're supposed to say at the end of a sermon. This is actually what the Gospel of John lays out for us very systematically throughout its whole narrative, but especially after Jesus' resurrection. Watch this. In John 20, Jesus appears for the first time after the resurrection to Mary Magdalene in the garden, but she doesn't recognize him until he calls her by her name. And then he sends her right away to be the first announcer of this good news, to go to the disciples and be the first evangelist. And then a few verses later, in that same chapter, Jesus appears to the disciples in a locked room, and he says, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you." And then, in John 21, Jesus appears again to the disciples, this time over a fish breakfast at the seashore, at which point Jesus asks Peter, famously, 3 times, "Do you love me?" And 3 times, Peter, who just a few days previously had denied he even knew Jesus 3 times, says, "Yes, Jesus, of course I love you." And each time, Jesus says, "Well, feed my sheep." Like, don't just tell me you love me, Peter. That's easy. Do what I do. Take care of my people. Be the good shepherd. And he follows it, ends the conversation by saying, "Follow me." Which means, of course, feeding, meeting physical needs, but also knowing folks by name. So May is Mental Health Awareness Month, an opportunity, according to NAMI, for all of us to come together and remember the inherent value we each hold, no matter our diagnosis, appearance, socioeconomic status, background, or ability. And I like that. And we could just as easily call it Good Shepherd Month, an opportunity for all of us to come together, no matter our diagnosis or appearance or socioeconomic status or background or ability, and regardless of whatever the factors are in our life and in the world around us that seem ready to come only to steal and kill and destroy, an opportunity to come together, to be known, and to know each other by name, to receive together the gift the Good Shepherd gives, life, and that life abundantly.